Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. I am again joined by my friend Niall Stanage, who is here to help me deliver the report on all the news going on in our great country.
The news and all the perspective, and there's a lot of it. Happy Thursday, Robby.
Happy Thursday.
I hope you're doing well, and why don't you get us started with telling us what is on your radar?
Here we go. Well, we're going to check in with Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and the 2024 running mate of Vice President Kamala Harris, who recently admitted in an interview his role on the ticket was to set white guys at ease and make them feel like they could vote for Kamala Harris, a progressive black woman, because Walz knows white guy code. That was the line. Let's watch this clip.
I knew I was on the ticket. I would argue because we did a lot of amazing progressive things in Minnesota that improved people's lives. But I also was on the ticket, quite honestly, because I could code talk to white guys watching football, fixing their truck, doing that I could put them at ease. I was the permission structure to say, look, you can do this and vote for this.
I was on the ticket, quite honestly, because I could code talk to white guys watching football and fixing their truck. That's the quote. Now, Walz also admits that it didn't work because the Harris-Walz ticket wasn't able to win enough of those voters, those white guys whose language Tim Walz understands. Now, the remarks prompted a lot of derision on social media yesterday. The clumsy phrase code talk was trending on X. Walz made it sound like he spoke some secret language of white dudes. The Spectator's Stephen Miller wonders, why do Dems need to talk in code to white dudes to begin with? I think that's the issue there. And Chris Arnand points out that viewing it as a kind of secret language, saying you can code talk, mean there's a 98% chance people will see through your fake BS. That's what he said. So I have some thoughts on this as well, from one white dude, me, Robby Soave, to another, Tim Walz. Look, Tim, if that's the reason you were on the ticket, first and foremost, well, I had to say, you're a DEI hire. Now, look, I understand the presidential ticket often takes into account gender and race and formerly geography, as it can be important to have a VEEP who's from one of the states you need to win. In our electoral system, not all the states are equally important. Still, if your main qualification is that you're supposedly appealing to a specific identity group, I think it's just not a good sign. That's because the interests of identity groups, to the extent identity groups even have shared interests, are not necessarily just to get someone who superficially resembles them into a position of power. It's not like all black women love Kamala Harris, and if they do love her, it's not simply because she's herself a black woman. That's a very reductionist way of doing politics, frankly. One of the Democratic Party's progressive elites are absolutely in love with doing politics this way, but it just doesn't have the greatest track record. Now, I could call out Republicans for the same thing, by the way. When John McCain added Sarah Palin to the ticket in 2008, it was transparently because he was seeking a woman, not necessarily to appeal to female voters, but to make the ticket more interesting, historically groundbreaking, visually appealing, etc. And we know how that turned out. Turned out she was perhaps not the most qualified person for that job. So that's issue number one I have with what Walz said. But issue number two is probably even more glaring and fundamental. Now, Walz could code talk, he said he could code talk to white dudes because he likes watching football and fixing trucks. Think about that for just 1 minute. Is it really only white dudes who like watching football and fixing trucks? Now, to be clear, those are predominantly dude interests. They're just not white dude interests, as far as I know. Race has nothing to do with it. Black guys watch football, fix trucks. Increasingly, race actually is being depolarized in our society. It's a good thing. It's not necessarily to the Dems' advantage, however. Trump actually did shockingly well with young male voters of color. The point is that Democrats are not struggling with a particular racial demographic. What they are struggling with is men of any race, and particularly young men. Now, I was reminded of that yesterday when we were talking about Decision Desk HQ's latest poll results for Trump. The gender gap is as wide as it's ever been. Far more men approve of Trump than do women. This matters because Walz is still hung up on the idea that the Democratic Party needs to be able to message more effectively to white people. The problem is broader than that. The party needs to message more effectively to men in general, not white men, men. For so long, progressive elites have been so obsessed with race, I think it's hard for them to talk about anything else, even though the salient factor here, young males.
So I think there's a few points here, Robby.
It's a good conversation for us two white dudes to have.
Exactly. We're well placed to talk from our lived experience on this one. No, I think that there is the argument I think that Walz is making is that Kamala Harris as a black woman was portrayed, certainly in more culturally and politically conservative quarters, as being part of a kind of cultural elite. And he was being brought in as someone who could more talk to voters in the heartland. It is worth noting, and you raised this in your radar, actually, Kamala Harris's problem was not with white voters, with whom she did almost identically to President Biden 4 years previously. And in fact, she did very similarly with black voters as well. The key issues were Latino voters, where she fared significantly worse, voters without college degrees, with whom she again fared worse, and young voters. So it's hard to know whether you make the argument that, oh, well, Tim Walz worked then, he shored up, or whether they were looking at the wrong problem. Also, though, when it comes to the kind of mockery that you weren't engaging in, but there was some stuff online, it does seem to me that whatever the validities of some of those criticisms, there's often a situation where Democrats are criticized whatever they are perceived to represent culturally. AOC can be disregarded because she was a bartender, but Elizabeth Warren can be disregarded because she's a former Harvard Law professor. Tim Walz can be disregarded because he's this Midwestern white dude, but Kamala Harris is a black woman coastal elite. Chuck Schumer can be disregarded because he's too weak and too part of the establishment. Jasmine Crockett can be discarded because she's too anti-establishment and militant, or Ilhan Omar, the same thing. So if you're not liberal, that's fine. You can oppose people on their views. But sometimes I think these are just bad faith arguments, trying to discard or disregard people because of identity in a way that's just a bit fraudulent, because Democrats can't win in that respect.
Oh, no, I agree with you. If you're focusing on personality flaws, you can always find something. But I would argue that Democrats, not all Democrats certainly, but many Democratic elites have placed a premium on identity and really leaned into identity as I would argue in some cases maybe to mask policies that are not necessarily going to be popular, or vast expansions of the federal government that will make people nervous, even if they do support, abstractly the goal of having a more robust social safety net or, more health care coverage or something. The details of how Democrats propose to do that makes people very wary, and so they lean in some cases on identity arguments. And with Tim Walz, I'm not saying it's like a fake idea. Obviously, I don't know the man. I'm not saying the interests he purports to have in sports and whatever are false. I don't think he was as naturally, this just sounds like cool or so interested in those things that it was going to be a cover for whatever his political agenda is. In the same way, like, I know what they're trying to do. Again, it's the Joe Rogan of the left idea. They're trying to have someone who is just cool and well liked by these voters that they're losing, young, not young white guys, just men in general, who then has policies they like.
Well,
and they had that idea, like Tim Walz was that maybe on paper to them, and I think they didn't look at it more closely than that.
Yeah, but I think where I perhaps disagree with you a bit is the idea that, the policies are the problem. There has been a persistent push from conservative media to not merely disparage democratic policies of various kinds, but to cast them as in some way un-American or out of step with real America. And real America, as it is characterized in conservative media, is almost always white, conservative, and often small town or rural. And I think Walz was put forth as somewhat of an antidote to that. Now, in addition, I just don't obviously agree with that argument. The Bronx is as much part of real America as, rural Ohio. So I don't agree with the characterization, but I do think that there is a vulnerability there that Democrats had to try to repair or ease to the best extent possible.
Up next on Rising, Trump spilled the tea on his conversation with Zelensky, shared his thoughts on whether Stephen A. Smith should run for president. That was all a fascinating News Nation town hall event that we will recap for you coming up next.